Good morning. Bonjour, sénatrices et sénateurs.
Good morning, Senators.
And thank you for joining us this morning for this first Senators Climate Solutions session for 2023. We're fortunate the Assistant Deputy Minister, Tara Shannon, Canada's Chief Negotiator for COP15, and Kelly Tork, Director General Biodiversity, Policy and Partnership at the Canadian Wildlife Service, have agreed to speak to members of our Senators for Climate Solutions group. Ambassador for Climate Change, Christine Stewart, regrets that she couldn't be with us due to travel constraints. Thank our members and staff who took the time to complete our member survey. Your feedback and guidance is invaluable, and we'll be following up with you regarding setting our priorities going forward. We're very much looking forward to this morning's session on COP15 and also the event we have planned for next week on powering Canada's future, greening and growing the grid. Pleased to be hosting this event alongside our co-chair, Stan Kuchar, and I thank our staff and our interpreters for their help, especially your help this morning with making this session happen. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to acknowledge that we're having this session on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. Assistant Deputy Minister Tara Shannon and Director General Kelly Tork will speak with our group today to share what Canada's goals were for COP15 on biodiversity, outline a little bit of the COP process, identified any challenges that came up, and highlight what was accomplished. A Q&A period will follow, moderated by our colleague Senator Kuchar. At the bottom right of your Zoom window, you can find the icon that indicates interpretation. Please click on that and choose your preferred language. In order to speak during the meeting, you will require a Senate-grade headset. And I'll now turn the session over to our guests. Thank you again for joining us today. We're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci tout le monde. I'm joining you this morning from Vancouver, the unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm here for the Impact 5 conference. And I have with me, as you noted, my Director General, Kelly Tork, who is responsible for many things, but one of her key areas of focus at the moment is on the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, otherwise known as the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework. I understand that really the focus, Senators, here is providing some time for some Q's and A's. So I don't think that we'll take that much of the time for a presentation. We did have a short deck, and I don't know if it made it to all of you. No. Okay. I think it's on its way to you. So we won't speak to slides in a deck, but maybe what I'll do is just provide a bit of context. The short deck will be on its way. It may be just useful reference material. I think what I'll do is just context for the COP. The COP, as you know, Canada was asked to take on the responsibility of host location for the COP in June of 2022. And we had 5 months to bring together the COP in a period that usually takes about 2 years. It was the largest biodiversity climate of the parties ever. We had in the end 12,000 people who attended the COP. I believe there were almost 20,000 who had registered for accreditation, but in the end, 12,000 people joined us on the ground in Montreal. As context, the previous Conference of the Parties 4 years earlier in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, was only 4,000, had only 4,000 delegates. I think the reason why I'm speaking to that is I think one of my reflections is that this Conference of the Parties for Biodiversity signals a shift in understanding of the importance of biodiversity and the close relationship of protecting biodiversity and achieving objectives vis-a-vis climate change. At a couple of other features I will speak to about the COP, and then we can go to the outcomes of the negotiation itself. We had the second ever Canada Pavilion at a conference of the parties, the first ever having been at COP27 in Egypt. The pavilion was very well attended. Focus at the pavilion was on programming, of course, that focused on biodiversity, but from a Canadian perspective, our real objective was in particular to highlight the role of Indigenous peoples in conservation and protection of biodiversity. There was also an Indigenous pavilion outside of what was called the Blue Zone, and led by a group called the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, also well attended by Indigenous peoples, not only from Canada, but internationally. And I would say of course, it was not led by Canada. We did provide some funding for it, but that Indigenous village, it was called, I think was a bit of a best practice as well that we learned coming out of the COP in terms of a participatory COP, which was one of our key objectives. Now for the Canada's objectives going into the negotiations, we had several. But top for us was to achieve a target that would see the protection of 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. We achieved that outcome. That's called Target 3. And it was, I think, the protection of 30% of terrestrial lands was less controversial, I think, for some parties than maybe 30% of marine. And so it's I think, an enormous feat that the Global Biodiversity Framework has the commitment to 30% for both lands and oceans. We also were, a priority for Canada was that there be a reflection of the role and the importance of the role of Indigenous peoples in conservation in and of itself. And we achieved that. There is a target on the role of Indigenous peoples in conservation. We also wanted a global biodiversity framework that recognized the role of women in biodiversity, and that was achieved. We wanted a framework that also would speak to the key drivers of biodiversity loss. So addressing those key drivers. So that includes things like pollution, and a framework that would see a real target on decreasing the loss of species at risk globally. You asked in the beginning, your opening context, you asked about challenges in the negotiations. That's a very good question. I think what I would say is the challenge in the negotiations here were the challenge that you would see in any multilateral negotiations. You had to come to an agreement in the context of seeking the endorsement of all 196 parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So multilateralism can be challenging sometimes in that context, but so it was keeping that focus on ambition. We wanted an ambitious framework, a framework that has goals and targets that are measurable, and that sets the framework apart from the 2010 Aichi targets, which did not have a measurability. So I think I will stop here, except to say that we achieved ambition with the Global Biodiversity Framework, and now what the focus of all parties is to then turn the framework into national action plans. The negotiations, the framework allows for 2 years for parties to develop those national action plans. That is a process that we are now endeavoring upon. And so I think, that is the next challenging part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and that is its implementation. And that is something, as I noted at the beginning, that Kelly Tork on the screen is very much focused on. If I may, Senators, I took about, I think, 4 minutes there. If I may ask if Kelly has anything that she would like to add, if that's okay. Thank you. Kelly?
Thank you. The significant outcome, as Tara mentioned, was this ambitious new global biodiversity framework that really sets the frame for international, ambition and collective action from now to 2030, with a vision towards 2050 as well. And I think it's a reflection of a greater recognition of just the extent of the biodiversity crisis globally. We know that one of the key global assessments in recent years in 2019 indicated that there are up to 1 million species at risk of extinction. Tara mentioned the addressing the key drivers of biodiversity loss. And a really a key outcome was also the adoption of emissions statement within the new global biodiversity framework that looks to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, and seeking to put nature on a path to recovery by 2050. So that broader frame of halting and reversing is a really, is a little bit of a, that mission and a galvanizing kind of call of recognizing that things, that there's action that needs to be taken across the board. The final framework has 4 goals and 23 specific targets. And they do, as Tara noted, address those key drivers of biodiversity loss. And those key drivers are pollution, land use change, and sea use change is the key driver of biodiversity loss globally. Climate change is another key driver of biodiversity loss, invasive alien species, as well as over-exploitation or over-harvesting of species. And so linked to that, I mentioned climate change. I know that the name of your of the group within you, which you convene, links to addressing climate change. There was also an important recognition of the close connection between climate change and biodiversity loss, and the importance of addressing both of those challenges together. So things like nature-based solutions are explicitly mentioned within the global biodiversity framework. So restoration of and conservation of important ecosystems, as well as really the importance of any actions taken to address climate change, also avoiding negative impacts on biodiversity. So that importance of coherence. And finally, it might also add that really is intended to be a framework for all. So it's quite comprehensive in the sense of seeking to engage business, to engage, as Tara noted, Indigenous peoples, women in the implementation, but all sectors, all levels of government, including subnational governments. And the province of Quebec was very active and engaged in leading some of the conversations with subnational governments around the world to support implementation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much to you both. Kelly, thanks for those points, and Tara, I think you really downplayed how incredible this work was to get this going. Most of these things take many years to organize, and I just want to acknowledge the incredible work that the federal government, the city of Montreal did in such an amazingly short time to pull this off. And it went well. I unfortunately got COVID and could not make the components that I was looking forward to, but Senator Cardoso took my spot, so I know that he gained a lot from that and was able to contribute. And I think it was certainly, from my perspective, sitting and coughing my lungs out, was really a lovely example of the realization of how dealing with climate change and biodiversity loss can't be separated one from the other. So thank you, and to the government of Canada and to the City of Montreal for the incredible work that you did. If you have questions, could you just pop your name in the question in the chat list, and I will use that to order questions. I have a number of questions that others have asked me to present, but we'll start with people who put their name in the chat. So Senator Sorensen, you got there first, so you go first, please.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. This is Karen Sorensen. I'm a senator for Alberta. I happen to live in Banff National Park. So all of this conversation is near and dear to my heart. I'm assuming some of you have worked with my friend Harvey Locke, who is my my neighbor and one of the people I meet with regularly. That being said, you have to speak to me like I'm in kindergarten, because I have not done a lot of work on this topic, and I know the acronym COP, and I'm trying to understand more about all the work that's being done. So I'm particularly interested in the goal of 30% preservation of lands and oceans by 2030. And I'm just going to talk for a minute, if you can keep track of my questions. First of all, when you refer to parties, I think that probably means countries, but I'll ask you to elaborate on that. And I also think I understand that these are global goals. And then at the end of Tara's comment, she was saying now it's time for Canada and others to implement those. I feel that goal's been out there for a while. I feel even when I was the mayor of Banff, I don't know what year it was, I met with a group that was talking about this, 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm just interested in the history. And I guess the last part of that is, if we're trying to reach 30%, where are we currently in Canada and I suppose globally as well? And I don't know where Kelly is, but Tara, thanks for showing up at 6 a.m. or whatever time it is on the West Coast. Okay, I think that's it. If you can just kind of elaborate on some of those topics for me.
Okay. Yes, I can. And thank you very much. And thank you to the reminder that not all of the world exists in the bureaucratic space of acronyms. I appreciate that. I get that reminder when I go home to visit my family on Vancouver Island, but I do need to remind myself on a day-to-day basis. So COP is Conference of the Parties. It's just a fancy word for all of the countries who have signed on to particular treaty, in this case, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the goals are indeed global. And then it's what we have to translate these global goals into a domestic reality. On the question of the 30%, you are absolutely right that this has been a target out there for some time, a number of years. There's a group that's called the High Ambition Coalition. It has, I think, 120 or so countries that are part of that High Ambition Coalition. Canada is one of the parties, so one of the countries that is a part of that coalition. And that coalition has been calling for a long time for the protection of 30% of lands and oceans by 2030. And so while it has been out there and a large sense of endorsement, if you have over 100 countries that have signed on to that, it was still not a target in any document associated with the Global Biodiversity Framework, with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So its incorporation into the Global Biodiversity Framework is very, we think, critical, because I think people like Harvey Locke would tell you that 30% is the minimum that we need to get to what Kelly was referring to as the underlying objective of halting and reversing biodiversity loss. As referenced in the Aichi targets, which was the decade framework that preceded this recent Kunming-Montreal framework, the targets were 17% terrestrial and 10% marine by 2020. So now, where is Canada? On terrestrial, we are at about 13.6%. We have a ways to go. And on marine, I believe I will have to confirm this, but I think marine is just over 14%. So I think sharing that shows you that the 30% is indeed ambitious, but it is an ambitious target that we are working very closely with our colleagues in Parks Canada and Fisheries and Oceans to meet. And I think the last thing I'll say there is we don't, however, approach any protected or conserved area without the partnership of the Indigenous governments in that area and PT, provincial or territorial jurisdictions. So just I think that we went yes, we have more we have to accomplish there, but we will be approaching any addition with full partnership with those that are involved in the local land area. So I guess what I'm saying is sometimes that can take some time.
Kelly, do you have anything in addition to add to that thoughtful response?
Tara's, I think, captured it beautifully. I might, just in response to your comment, Senator Sorensen, about kind of that stepping back and a bit of the make a couple as well, that just to kind of situate things when we talk about the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, it's one of the 3 kind of Rio conventions that was adopted back in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And so the 3 are the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, as well as the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it is, it was adopted and initiated in that kind of broader context at the same time. Canada does host the Secretariat for that convention, for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is one of the key reasons that the location of the COP was shifted at the last minute to Canada. So Canada has a very long-standing, strong leadership role within the Convention on Biological Diversity, and essentially all UN countries except the United States are parties to the CBD. The Holy See is the only other kind of country that's not a party. So it's a very much a global agreement.
Thank you
Great.
both very much.
Thank you very much. So the next on our list is Senator Osler. Senator Osler, please.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I'll introduce myself. I'm a physician and a very new senator. So forgive me if my question seems a little bit out there. But as a physician, I've worked with different groups on the impact of the climate crisis on health. And so my question relates to more public health and future pandemic preparedness. Because as I was listening to the presentation, I was thinking that with the loss of biodiversity, and we are hearing about the increased risks of zoonotic spillover, so that's viruses jumping from animals to humans. If I put my public health future pandemic preparedness hat on, I'm wondering if is there any information or discussions or your thoughts on that? Does that somehow fit into the frameworks? So right now, I think I'm just seeking a little bit more information from you on that. And question can go to anybody who has any comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And it's a very, it's not a silly question. It's a very profound question. And indeed, the framework, there is not a target in the framework that addresses what we call the One Health principle, but there is a reference in the framework to the principle of One Health, which is getting to the point that you're making, is that there is a link between biodiversity and pandemic. We've seen that, of course, recently and and so acknowledging the link of biodiversity to broader health considerations. But I'm going to turn it to Kelly because she has done some work over the years on what's called the One Health principle. So Kelly, over to you.
Thank you. Just getting used to the unmute, but now absolutely. So there was very active discussion in the negotiations, as Tara mentioned, about health, the links between human health and ecosystem health. We talk about the ecosystem services, which is essentially the benefits that well-functioning kind of nature ecosystems provide to people, the importance of conserving those. Some of those services and the links between health and people include things like access to nature and being out in nature, and just the sort of psychological and or physiological benefits of having outdoor recreation. There's targets are associated with access to green space, for example, sort of recognizing the kind of mental health and physical health benefits of nature. On the zoonotics side, there is a reference to recognizing the, like in one of the species related conservation and recovery targets, about looking at the link between the, risks to risks of zoonotic disease as well, and just the links and impacts on species as well as humans. And close engagement with the World Health Organization representatives and others in the conversation. So there's a real interest in ensuring that there's that complementarity and coherence. The direct link between zoonotic and disease emergence and stresses on biodiversity, I think, is a very active conversation. There's a lot of complexity around that, so it's not necessarily quite as as clear how and if, like, what those links are, but certainly there's some consideration that increased exposure of human wildlife contact through expansion of people into places that may not previously have had a lot of human interaction, that might be one contributor. So I think that that's something that's certainly still being very much examined, and we also know that there's the domestic wildlife, like domesticated animals, wild animal interaction is another consideration, but that's part of the overall looking at how to address species diversity and species recovery. Not sure if that helps. Okay.
Did you use that what you wanted to hear?
Very much. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Over to Senator Quinn. Senator Quinn, please.
Thank you, Senator Kusher, and thanks very much for our guests laying the groundwork for today's discussion. I'm particularly interested in the 30% as it relates to marine. And it's timely that this presentation is taking place, because last night at our Fisheries Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, we had witnesses that represented the inshore fisheries, particularly on the east coast of Canada. And they talked about all of the challenges that they face day to day. And one of the ones they mentioned was the increasing amount of ocean territory that comes under as protected marine protected areas. And so the target of 30%, my question really is, you mentioned that there's dialogue with Fisheries and Oceans, but what's the nature of that dialogue? Is there a balancing of where the fish stocks are that the inshore fishers want access to? And they talked about how those protected areas often will infringe upon the very areas that they want to fish in. And so I'm just wondering, the consultation process, Fisheries does do some consultation, but do you folks do consultation directly with those associations who are in the field, if you will, very directly making their living and providing for their families and communities? So I'm just wondering how that part of it works.
So I think first on marine, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is very much the lead on the 30% target in marine areas. We do in marine areas for Environment and Climate Change Canada, we do have a small slice of national kind of national wildlife areas that are national wildlife marine areas. But really the lead for the 30% on marine would be the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So I don't want to speak for them, but into any of the work that they're undertaking. But what I could say is two things. In the first instance, there's a range of standards internationally that meet the requirements to be counted. And those range on one end from what's called an other effective conservation measure, which is an area that's primary purpose is not necessarily biodiversity, but it's managed in a way that it's achieving biodiversity outcomes. So a terrestrial example therefore is the Shiloh Forces Base in Manitoba is in fact an other effective conservation measure. It's a working military base, but the way that it's managed is such that it protects the biodiversity of the area is not reversed, as it were. And then on the other end of this spectrum, you have a legislated protected area like a park. So there's standards that allow for various types of land use or not within the international accounting system for the 30% target. What I can say in terms of your question about consultation, when we are consulting on creation of an area, we will work with the provincial territorial jurisdiction in which the land is found. I've mentioned that we will work with the Indigenous governments and other municipalities. I think on the questions of municipalities, we would generally look to provincial and territorial governments to lead that, given that municipalities are creations of the provincial territorial government. So I'm not sure. I'm not answering your question on marine. I think I'm just trying to give you a context of what we do on terrestrial, and I hope that that's helpful.
Thank you for that. Kelly, do you have anything additional that you want to throw into the mix here?
Perhaps just that there are also, we've focused on sort of target 3, which is the protected and conserved areas 30% target. There are also targets related to sustainable use of wild species and sustainable management in key sectors, the natural resource sectors. So there's a target that is focused on sustainable management of fisheries, forests, aquaculture. And so that also picks up on, just for, is relevant. And again, DFO, our federal colleagues on the fisheries side will be engaged particularly in that element and building on the work that's already been done domestically in Canada.
Senator Quinn, did you have, you seemed that you were ready to ask another supplementary?
Yeah, supplementary if I may, and thank you for those responses. It is helpful indeed to have a better understanding of how it all fits together. But just a sidetrack question for me, and that is when you're working with the Indigenous governments, how heavy does traditional knowledge play in the discussion? Because that's an area that, in my experience, people don't have a real appreciation for, and yet it's so important. I'm just wondering, does it have that level of importance as you folks do your work?
The short answer is yes. And I think in many ways, a lot of what's in the global biodiversity framework are things that Canada we already have in train. On the question of Indigenous traditional knowledge, for example, for the Species at Risk Act, we have what's called the I only know it by its acronym. I might turn to Kelly, but the National Aboriginal Committee on Species at Risk. I think I got it right. Yes, otherwise known as NACO. Council, who advises. So there's a formal. There's the committee that is the scientific committee for the review of species at risk, and making recommendations to the government as to whether a species should be added to the list of endangered or protected. There is within that committee Indigenous representation, but in addition to that, we also have this council that is advising us on questions around species at risk, taking into account Indigenous traditional knowledge. I would also say, and it's outside of the Canadian Wildlife Service, but there is in our science and technology branch, for example, in Environment and Climate Change Canada, there is a relatively new position on this very question of Indigenous traditional knowledge and incorporation of that in science. And of course, this, our science and technology branch would be working very closely with us on any implementation of the framework or any other work that we do.
Okay, thank you for that. And that's great to hear that. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Before going on to a question that just put in, I want to ask one of my own, and that similar, but not quite exactly like Senator Quinn. We both are on that same committee, but focusing on oceans. And Canada's part of the Ocean Research Network. In fact, plays a huge role in that area. And it's so important for biodiversity to actually know what you have, because you can't measure if you're losing it if you don't know what's actually there. And therein lies the rub. So in 2022, for example, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration of the United States did a study on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is everybody in the world knows is the longest mountain range in the world. And to all sorts of surprise, they found over 20 new species that we didn't even know existed. Ranging from the dinner plate jellyfish to something that really makes my spine crawl, called blue goo in the Caribbean region. And so the question is, what's Canada doing to actually measure the biodiversity that is actually in our oceans, and how comfortable are we with knowing what even the stocks that we know, say fish stocks that we know are there, being able to effectively count them, and then how do we do that while we look at the impact of climate change on oceans, because these species move from one place to another. As the ocean warms, species change location. As the ocean acidifies, it loses oxygen, deoxygenate, these species change spaces. So I think this is an incredibly complex problem that the science, even the basic counting science, we may not be where we need to be. So I'd like to ask, what is Canada planning to do? What are we actually doing? And how are we going to measure those things first?
So I'll have to give my apologies, Senator. I'm not well placed to answer the question on oceans, but I think what we can do is commit to bring a question to our colleagues at Department of Fisheries and Oceans. You are talking about questions around marine spatial planning, and marine spatial planning featured in the global biodiversity framework and in negotiations, discussions. And I believe, there's targets that address the questions around spatial planning in general, because as you say, it's, if we're going to halt and reverse, we have to know what we've got and understand the various ecosystem landscapes. But apologies, unable to answer exactly the question on what is happening on marine spatial planning.
All right, well, thank you for that. Kelly, any your thoughts? No. All right, so we'll have to dig further on that one. So I'm going to read one from Stephanie Lavoilette. So here we go. The Prime Minister said in his end-of-year interview with Rosemary Barton in December, there would be a piece of legislation for accountability on these biodiversity targets, similar to the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. Can we expect legislation on this anytime soon, hopefully in 2023?
So thank you for the question. I know my minister also referenced accountability in the closing news conference. Sorry, I muted myself. I was just saying my minister noted accountability legislation in the closing news conference at the Conference of the Parties in Montreal. As for timing, I mean, I can't, I don't have an answer on timing. So we are well aware of both the Prime Minister's commitments at the in his end of the year interview, and then also would just point back to the statements made in the closing media conference.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I have a question here on Indigenous people's participation in planning for Canada. It was encouraging to see so many more Indigenous peoples from around the world at the last meeting. But the question is more specifically in Canada, and it has a little Senate twist to it as well. So what opportunities are being developed? And you've told us a little bit about the council. We appreciate that. To further create meaningful collaboration with Indigenous peoples to meet our biodiversity commitments. And what role, if any, do you think that we as senators could play? We're Senators for Climate Solutions. One of our members, Don Anderson, is hosting a panel this week that I'll talk about soon with people to discuss issues pertaining to biodiversity and climate change in the North. What specific plans or directions is the federal government creating to address this, ensure that we have very meaningful consultation?
Thank you. It's a really good good question. I would point to, in particular, like we have a number of ways in which we engage and consult with Indigenous partners through all of our biodiversity objectives. I've referred to a couple of them. We are establishing distinctions-based nature tables. So with the First Nations, Inuit, Métis, to help advise us on these various issues, or not just around the framework, but the whole full scope of our day-to-day work. I would also, for me, reference, I'll reference the Indigenous Guardians program. It's a pilot project that was first funded through, I believe it was budget 2018. It really is a I think a remarkable program. And what it is it's individual communities are putting forward guardians initiatives so that they're doing the some of the spatial planning in their communities, or various conservation activities in communities. So, and linking back into a real kind of like deepening of the role of Indigenous traditional knowledge in conservation and national. Sorry, I'm being told my connection is unstable. I'm on Wi-Fi, so I apologize if I cut out. But we announced the first national committee for Indigenous gardens, and the first one of its kind globally. So I'm quite, in many ways, this Guardians Initiative, it's a program that we fund, but it's an initiative really of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and others in Métis and Inuit communities. And so I think what I would suggest, if you are interested, there are, the committee might want to ask for a presentation at some point in time from those who lead on Indigenous Guardians initiatives to because I'm talking about it as a program that I think is really quite amazing, but I'm not in many ways the best place to speak about it because I'm not the one on the ground Kelly, anything you would add?
No, I think that sums it up nicely, Tara.
Great. Thank you very much. And I have a whole list of questions that were sent to me, but I'm going to ask one more and then we'll have to wrap it up because everybody is moving on to other things and really acknowledge and thank you for your time. This issue comes to the question that's probably the least important, money. I think a fair amount of money, 200 billion, if I recall, was promised at COP15. What are your thoughts on, first of all, was that enough? Will it be, how will it flow? Will it make a difference? How does Canada participate in that? Should Canada be a prime leader? Just help us understand how that might all work.
Okay, I'll start off and I'll ask Kelly to add anything that I missed. So the 200 billion, it's important to note that the issue of resource mobilization, of course, was very much one of the key areas of focus when we got to the end of negotiations in Montreal. It's resource mobilization from all sources. So it's not just governments, business, philanthropy. It's also, maybe realigning harmful subsidies. It's like, so it's a full scope of what does it mean to mobilize resources. I would reference for your information, there was a 10-point plan on the question of resource mobilization that was issued at the UN General Assembly at the end of September, led really by the UK, Ecuador, Gabon, and Chile, if I'm not, yes, I'm getting a nod. And to sort of start to shift the conversation on resource mobilization from just one of official development assistance, which is important, to the broader, how do we think about and fund biodiversity across all sectors of society? So in Canada, of course, we have a key role in terms of the support that we provide to global biodiversity initiatives outside of Canada through things like official development assistance. And then I would also say, in terms of the question of funding and resource mobilization, this is where I think that Canada is showing leadership domestically and has been for a number of years. We have, since 2018, invested over $5 billion in various initiatives that link to biodiversity. So to answer the question, it's for Canada, we need to think about this question of resource mobilization the way that we are, which is both internationally and then domestically. So I'll stop there and see if I may ask Kelly if she's got anything she would add.
For the 200 billion, which is mobilizing that level by 2030, as Tara mentioned, from all sources, it does also meant to capture domestic investments that countries are making, as well as all sectors. There's a complementary component of that target, which is looking at mobilizing $20 billion by 2025 and $30 by 2030 in flows from developed countries to developing countries. So that's a kind of an acknowledgement as well that there is support that developed countries can provide to developing countries to help them with implement the global biodiversity framework. So there is a new fund that's going to be established under the main kind of financial mechanism of the convention, the Global Environment Facility, to do that. And Prime Minister Trudeau at the start of the COP did announce a new investment from Canada of $350 million to support international, to support other countries in implementation. So that's a little bit of of an initial indication of some of the leadership that Canada is taking in that space. But recognition that for the 2025 and 2030, there are additional actions that countries will need to be reflecting on.
Great. Thank you very much. That's such a complicated area. You've helped us start to parse parts of it apart, and we'll need to take a deeper dive and get a better understanding of that for sure. Thank you both. And we're going to wrap up. So I just want to thank you both for taking time out of your days, wherever you are in this country, and appreciate you participating and helping us learn more and more about these complex and absolutely necessary topics so that we can be effective in our own work. For the senators and staff, as Mary mentioned, our next session is a week from today, Wednesday the 15th. It'll be a virtual panel called Powering Canada's Future, What Will It Take to Green and Grow the Grid? So this is a huge challenge and a major area for us to understand. Some of the people will be joining us: Carolyn Lee, who's the research lead of mitigation in the Canadian Climate Institute; Anthony Haynes, who's the president and CEO of Toronto Hydro; and Dr. Sarah Hastings-Simon, who's an assistant professor at the University of Calgary and an expert in climate policy and energy. Also, I mentioned earlier, Senator Anderson, one of our colleagues, is having an event on Thursday, February the 16th from 12 to 1:30 on Indigenous experience and leadership in Canada's far north and Arctic region, impacts of climate change on Indigenous communities. And those senators who are interested, and I would encourage all of you all of us to attend, please let Senator Anderson's office know. So with this, I want to once again thank our panelists. You've been exceedingly helpful to us. Thank particularly my co-chair, Senator Coyle, for her incredible leadership on this file, and everybody, all the senators and staff who attended. We learned a lot, and I hope everyone now can go and enjoy the rest of your day. So merci et voilà, Leo.